The harsh Arizona sun beat down on Hope O'Connor as she stumbled toward the stone well at the edge of Oatman, her parched lips cracked and bleeding. 3 days without proper food or water had left her weak, her once fine dress tattered and caked with the red dust of the desert. She gripped the rough stone of the well with trembling hands, her vision swimming as she tried to lower the bucket. The rope slipped through her fingers, her strength failing her when she needed it most. Hope had fled San Francisco with nothing but the clothes on her back and the locket around her neck, running from a past that threatened to consume her whole. Oatman was supposed to be just another stop on her journey eastward, but her dwindling funds and stolen supplies had left her desperate. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning a stale biscuit and a bruised apple she'd purchased from a traveling merchant before he'd tried to demand more than money as payment. "Madam, you look like you could use some help." The voice startled her. Hope turned too quickly and nearly collapsed, her knees buckling beneath her. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground. When her vision cleared, she found herself looking into the weathered face of a man wearing a broad-brimmed hat that shaded kind eyes. A cowboy, judging by the leather chaps and the dust on his boots. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her shaking body betrayed her lie. "Just need some water." The cowboy's gaze swept over her, taking in her disheveled appearance, the hollow cheeks, and the way her body trembled with exhaustion. Without a word, he reached for the well rope and drew up the bucket with practiced ease. He offered her the ladle first, rather than drinking himself. "Then drink," he said gently, "and stay a while. Oatman's not the kind of place a lady should be passing through alone, especially not in your condition." Hope hesitated, years of hard lessons making her wary of strangers, especially men with kind eyes, but thirst won out over caution. She took the ladle with both hands to steady it and drank deeply, the cool water like heaven on her parched throat. "Thank you," she managed after a moment. "I don't mean to be a burden." "No burden," he replied, filling the ladle again when she finished. "Name's Garrett Hawkins. I run cattle about 5 miles north of town." "Hope," she replied, offering only her first name. "Hope O'Connor." "Well, Miss O'Connor, when's the last time you had a proper meal?" The question made her stomach clench painfully, a reminder of its emptiness. "I'm managing just fine." Garrett's expression told her he didn't believe that for a second. "My wagon's hitched outside the general store. Let me buy you dinner at the hotel before you manage yourself into a grave." Hope opened her mouth to refuse pride and caution battling hunger, but her stomach growled loudly enough for them both to hear. A flush crept up her neck despite her exhaustion. "Just dinner," she conceded softly. "Then I'll be on my way." Garrett nodded, though something in his eyes suggested he had more to say on the matter. He offered his arm for support, which she reluctantly took after nearly stumbling again. "Fair warning," he said as they walked slowly toward Main Street. "Oatman's Hotel isn't exactly the Palmer House, but Mrs. Jenkins sets a decent table." "I'm sure it's fine," Hope murmured, trying not to lean too heavily on him despite her weakness. The Arizona Mining and Trading Company Hotel was a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days, but the aroma wafting from its dining room made Hope's mouth water. The few patrons inside, mostly miners and travelers, glanced up briefly as they entered, but quickly returned to their meals. Mrs. Jenkins, a plump woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun, eyed Hope with a mixture of concern and suspicion until Garrett explained they needed a meal. Her expression softened immediately. "Poor thing looks half-starved," she muttered, ushering them to a corner table. "I've got stew and fresh bread, and pie for after." Hope sat carefully, afraid her legs might give out completely. The wooden chair felt like the finest velvet compared to the hard ground she'd slept on for nights. Garrett removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked brown hair, and hung it on a nearby peg. "How'd you end up in Oatman?" he asked once Mrs. Jenkins had bustled away. Hope stiffened. "I'm traveling east to visit family." Must be important family to risk traveling alone through Apache territory. "I don't have much choice," she replied, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Before Garrett could press further, Mrs. Jenkins returned with 2 bowls of thick beef stew, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, and a pitcher of water. Hope tried to eat slowly to maintain some semblance of dignity, but the rich aroma broke her resolve. She tore into the food with barely disguised desperation. Garrett pretended not to notice her hunger, focusing on his own meal and making casual remarks about the unseasonably dry weather and the local silver mines. By the time Hope had cleaned her bowl and accepted a second helping, color had returned to her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, finally meeting his gaze directly. "You didn't have to do this." "Out here, folks look after each other," Garrett replied with a shrug. "Desert doesn't care much if you live or die, people have to care instead." "Is that why you stopped to help me?" "Partly." His honest eyes held hers. "Partly because no decent man would leave a lady in distress, and partly because you looked like you had a story worth hearing." Hope broke eye contact, staring down at her empty bowl. "Not all stories are worth telling, Mr. Hawkins." "Fair enough." He didn't push, which surprised her. Most men would have demanded answers in exchange for their charity. "Where are you staying tonight?" The question brought her back to reality. Hope had planned to sleep rough again, finding some sheltered spot at the edge of town. Her funds wouldn't stretch to a hotel room. "I should be moving on," she said, though the thought of walking even another mile made her bones ache. "In your condition, that's a death wish, Miss O'Connor." Garrett's voice was firm but not unkind. "There's a stage to Prescott day after tomorrow. Until then, you need rest." "I can't afford Mrs. Jenkins," Garrett called, cutting off Hope's protest. When the proprietress approached, he continued, "Miss O'Connor needs a room for 2 nights. Put it on my account." Hope's eyes widened. "Mr. Hawkins, I cannot accept. You can and you will," he interrupted gently. "Consider it a loan if your pride demands it. When you're back on your feet and settled wherever you're headed, you can send payment to Garrett Hawkins, Oatman, Arizona territory." Mrs. Jenkins nodded approvingly. "I'll ready the room at the end of the hall, nice and quiet there." When she departed, Hope leaned forward. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "You don't know me." Garrett considered her question seriously before answering. 6 years ago, I came to Arizona with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. A stranger gave me work when I needed it most. Said I could repay him by doing the same for someone else someday." He smiled slightly. "Reckon today's that day." There was something in his steady gaze that made Hope want to trust him, despite everything she'd learned about men's ulterior motives. She'd been running for so long that the thought of stopping, even for 2 nights, felt dangerous. "I have complications in my past," she admitted carefully. "Don't we all?" Garrett replied without judgment. "Whatever you're running from, it won't catch up to you in the next 2 days. Get some rest, eat regular meals, then decide your next move." Hope's exhaustion made the decision for her. She nodded slowly. 2 days, and I will repay you." "I believe you will," he said with a small smile. "Now, would you like some of that pie Mrs. Jenkins mentioned? Woman makes a peach pie that might make you reconsider heading east at all." Despite everything, Hope found herself returning his smile. "I haven't had pie in months." "Then you're in for a treat." That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in weeks, Hope dreamed not of the dangers she'd fled, but of kind eyes beneath a broad-brimmed hat and the unexpected safety she'd found in a dusty mining town named Oatman. Morning came with the sound of miners heading to early shifts and freight wagons rumbling down Main Street. Hope woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day flooded back. The room was simple: a bed, washstand, small table and chair, but felt luxurious after so many nights spent under the stars. She washed with the pitcher of water Mrs. Jenkins had provided, wincing at her reflection in the small mirror. Weeks of hard travel had left their mark. Her once lustrous dark hair hung limp, and shadows darkened the skin beneath her blue eyes. The dress she'd been wearing for days was beyond salvaging. A knock at the door startled her. "Miss O'Connor, it's Mrs. Jenkins," I've brought you some things." Hope opened the door cautiously to find the older woman holding a bundle of fabric and a tray of food. "Mr. Hawkins thought you might need these," Mrs. Jenkins explained, setting everything on the table. "Said to put it on his account. There's a dress that should fit well enough belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to California, and some breakfast. He had to ride back to his ranch but said he'd return tomorrow to see you off on the stage." Hope stared at the simple blue calico dress, a clean chemise and petticoat beneath it. "This is too much." "Nonsense," Mrs. Jenkins replied briskly. "Man's got no wife to spend his money on, might as well help a lady in need. Besides," she lowered her voice confidentially, "Garrett Hawkins isn't one for charity without good reason. Must see something special in you." Before Hope could respond, Mrs. Jenkins continued, "Eat while it's hot. I'll send up bath water later so you can have a proper wash." After the woman left, Hope sat heavily in the chair, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. She'd spent so long looking over her shoulder, trusting no one, that she'd forgotten such generosity existed. Part of her wanted to flee immediately, to not be indebted to anyone, especially not a man she barely knew. But her practical side recognized the opportunity to regain her strength before continuing her journey. The food was simple but nourishing: eggs, biscuits, and coffee. Hope ate every bite, savoring the feeling of fullness that had become so rare. Afterward, she examined the dress. It was plain but well made, clearly cared for by its previous owner. The thought of clean clothing against her skin almost brought tears to her eyes. Later, after the promised bath that left her feeling human again, Hope ventured downstairs. Mrs. Jenkins introduced her to her husband, a taciturn man who managed the hotel's modest bar, and suggested she might enjoy sitting on the small porch to get some fresh air. "Town's quiet today, Mrs. Jenkins assured her. "Most men are at the mines, you won't be bothered." The porch overlooked Oatman's main street, such as it was. The town existed primarily to serve the nearby gold mines, with the hotel, general store, assay office, and saloon comprising most of the businesses. Beyond the scattered buildings, the harsh Arizona landscape stretched toward distant mountains, beautiful in its starkness, but unforgiving to those who underestimated it. Hope sat in a rocking chair, watching the occasional passerby and the ever-present burros that wandered freely through town. The animals had been abandoned by miners when operations scaled back, becoming an unofficial mascot of Oatman. One particularly bold burro approached the porch, eyeing Hope hopefully. "He's looking for handouts," came a voice from the street. Hope turned to see a young woman about her age carrying a basket of laundry. "They're terrible beggars." "I'm afraid I have nothing to offer," Hope replied. The woman climbed the steps, setting her basket down. "I'm Alina Fletcher. My husband runs the assay office." "Hope O'Connor," she responded, hesitant but welcoming the company. "Just passing through. Mrs. Jenkins mentioned you." Alina sat in the adjacent chair. "Said Garrett Hawkins brought you in yesterday looking half dead." Hope winced at the blunt assessment. "I miscalculated the distance between water sources." "Happens to greenhorns," Alina said without judgment. "Arizona isn't forgiving that way." She studied Hope curiously. "You heading to family?" "Something like that," Hope answered vaguely. Alina nodded, seemingly understanding Hope's reluctance to elaborate. "Well, Garrett's a good man to have found you. One of the few decent ones around these parts. Built his ranch from nothing after prospecting didn't pan out for him. You know him well." "Everyone knows everyone in Oatman," Alina laughed. "But Garrett keeps mostly to himself since Sarah passed." "Sarah, his wife," Alina explained, "died of fever 3 years back. They'd only been married 8 months. She lowered her voice. "Some say that's why he rarely comes to town except for supplies. Too many memories." Hope felt a pang of sympathy for the cowboy who'd shown her such kindness. Loss was something she understood all too well. "He mentioned the stage to Prescott," Hope said, changing the subject. "Is it reliable?" "Reliable as anything out here," Alina shrugged. "Leaves every Wednesday and Saturday, weather permitting. Takes about a day and a half with stops. From there you can connect to bigger routes eastward. They chatted a while longer before Alina excused herself to deliver her laundry. The conversation left Hope thoughtful. Garrett Hawkins was becoming less of a mysterious benefactor and more of a real person with his own sorrows. The knowledge made her both more grateful for his help and more wary of forming any attachment. That afternoon, after a simple lunch, Hope decided to visit the general store. She still had a few coins left, and if she was to continue eastward, she'd need some basic supplies. The store was empty except for the proprietor, a balding man with spectacles who introduced himself as Mr. Thompson. "Mrs. Jenkins said to expect you," he nodded. "What can I help you with?" Hope purchased a small packet of jerky, some hard biscuits, and a tin canteen. It would have to be enough to supplement whatever food was available at stage stops. As Mr. Thompson wrapped her purchases, the bell above the door jingled. "Afternoon, Sheriff," the shopkeeper called. Hope tensed instinctively, not turning around. Law enforcement of any kind made her nervous. "Thompson," a deep voice responded. "Just need some tobacco and ammunition." "Help yourself to the tobacco. Got your usual shells behind the counter." Heavy boots moved across the wooden floor. Hope kept her eyes on the counter, hoping to complete her transaction without interaction, but luck wasn't with her. "Don't believe we've met, madam," the sheriff said, stopping beside her. "Sheriff Wilson, I make it a point to know everyone passing through Oatman." Hope forced herself to look up with a polite smile. Hope O'Connor, just waiting for the Saturday stage. Sheriff Wilson was a tall man with a graying mustache and sharp eyes that missed little. Those eyes assessed her now with professional curiosity. "Traveling alone?" "Yes," she replied, keeping her voice even. "Visiting family in the East." "Heard Garrett Hawkins found you in a bad way yesterday," the sheriff continued. "Lucky thing. Deserts claimed many who thought they could handle it. I'm grateful for Mr. Hawkins's assistance," she said carefully, "and for the hospitality of your town." Sheriff Wilson nodded slowly. "Oatman's small, but we look after our own and help travelers in need. Just make sure you're on that stage Saturday. Desert's no place for a woman alone, and not just because of the heat. Apache raids have picked up south of here." "I intend to leave on schedule," Hope assured him, heart racing at the mention of authorities checking passenger manifests. "Thank you for your concern." The sheriff seemed satisfied and moved to complete his own purchases. Hope paid for her supplies with shaking hands and left quickly, the weight of his gaze following her out the door. Back at the hotel, Hope paced her small room. The sheriff's appearance had rattled her more than she wanted to admit. While he seemed to suspect nothing, his very existence was a reminder that she couldn't stay in one place too long. The stage to Prescott couldn't come soon enough. As evening approached, Mrs. Jenkins brought dinner to her room, another bowl of the hearty stew and fresh bread. "Thought you might prefer eating up here," the woman said kindly. "Saturday nights get rowdy downstairs once the miners finish their shifts." "Thank you," Hope said gratefully. "You've been very kind." Mrs. Jenkins hesitated in the doorway. "Miss O'Connor, I don't mean to pry, but—" "Are you in some kind of trouble? Sheriff Wilson was asking about you after you left the store." Hope's blood ran cold. What did he want to know? Just where you came from, where you were headed. Standard questions he asks about strangers. Mrs. Jenkins gave her a measured look. "I told him you were a friend of Garrett's, which seemed to satisfy him." Hope looked away. "I appreciate your discretion. Like I said, not prying." Mrs. Jenkins adjusted her apron. "But if you need help beyond a room and meals, you should know there are folks here who'd provide it." Garrett Hawkins chief among them. After Mrs. Jenkins left, Hope sat on the edge of her bed, dinner forgotten as she contemplated her situation. The urge to flee immediately warred with practical considerations. Night travel was dangerous and she had no horse. The stage remained her best option, assuming no telegrams arrived before then asking the sheriff to detain a woman matching her description. She spent another restless night, waking at every creak and footstep in the hotel. By morning, she'd made up her mind to remain in her room until the stage departed, minimizing the chance of further interactions with the sheriff or other curious townsfolk. But fate had other plans. Mid-morning, another knock came at her door. This time it was Eleanor Fletcher. "Sorry to disturb you," Eleanor said breathlessly. "But Garrett Hawkins just rode into town. His foreman had an accident, caught his leg in a rope while branding and got dragged pretty bad. Doc Evans is out delivering a baby 20 miles south, won't be back till tomorrow." Mrs. Jenkins thought. She hesitated. Thought what? Hope asked, confused by the urgency. "She mentioned you had experience with nursing. Something you said about caring for your mother." Hope had indeed mentioned that to Mrs. Jenkins during a brief conversation about family. It was one of the few truthful things she'd shared. She had nursed her mother through a long illness before her death 5 years ago. "I'm not a trained nurse," Hope cautioned. "Better than what we've got," Eleanor pressed. "The man's in bad shape and Garrett's beside himself. His foreman Samuel is like family to him." Against her better judgment, Hope followed Eleanor downstairs. In the hotel's small dining room, now cleared of tables, a large man lay on a makeshift pallet, his right leg bloodied and bent at an unnatural angle. Garrett knelt beside him, face drawn with worry. He looked up as Hope entered, relief washing over his features. "Miss O'Connor," he said, rising. "I apologize for the intrusion on your rest, but—" Eleanor explained, Hope interrupted, already assessing the injured man from a distance. "I'm not a doctor, Mr. Hawkins. I know that," he replied grimly. "But Samuel needs help now. The bleeding slowed, but his leg—" Hope approached cautiously, kneeling to examine the injury. The man Samuel was conscious but clearly in agony, his dark skin ashen with pain and blood loss. His leg was a mess of torn flesh, with a compound fracture visible where the bone had pierced through. "I need hot water, clean cloth, whiskey, and something to use as splints," she instructed, falling back on the knowledge gained during her mother's illness and the practical medical care she'd learned from the doctor who'd attended her. "And laudanum if you have it." Garrett and Mrs. Jenkins moved quickly to gather supplies while Hope spoke softly to Samuel, assessing his other injuries and trying to keep him calm. He was a big man, probably in his 40s, with calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "You're going to be all right," she assured him, though she wasn't certain it was true. Such injuries could easily lead to infection, amputation, or death. "Rope caught me. Wrong," Samuel managed through gritted teeth. "My fault." "Save your strength," Hope advised. "We'll have you feeling better soon." When the supplies arrived, Hope set to work with an efficiency that surprised even herself. She cleaned the wound thoroughly with water and whiskey, her hands steady despite the man's occasional cries of pain. The bone needed setting, which would be the most difficult part. "Mr. Hawkins, I'll need your help," she said, looking up at Garrett. "And yours," she added to Mr. Jenkins, who had joined them. "We need to pull the leg straight while I align the bone. It will be extremely painful for him." Samuel was given laudanum and whiskey before the men positioned themselves at his feet. Hope nodded to them, and they pulled steadily while she manipulated the broken bone back into alignment. Samuel's scream was muffled against the leather belt he'd been given to bite down on, but the sound still chilled Hope's blood. With the bone set, Hope splinted the leg carefully and bound the whole thing tightly with strips of clean cloth. Throughout the procedure, she worked with a focus that left no room for her own fears or the memory of the sheriff's questions. Here was something concrete she could do, a way to repay some of the kindness she'd been shown. "He needs to stay still," she told Garrett when she'd finished. "The leg must be kept elevated and the bandages changed regularly. When the doctor returns, he should examine him properly." Garrett nodded, his expression showing both gratitude and something more admiration, perhaps. "We can move him to my ranch once he's stable enough for the wagon ride. I have a small cabin he uses when in town." "You have experience with injuries like this," Mr. Jenkins observed, not a question but a statement. Hope wiped her bloodied hands on a cloth. "My mother's doctor taught me some basic care during her illness. I've seen similar injuries before." No one pressed her for details, which was fortunate. The truth that she'd helped care for injured women at Madame Rosalind's establishment in San Francisco was not something she could share. By late afternoon, Samuel was resting as comfortably as possible on a proper bed in one of the hotel's ground-floor rooms. The laudanum kept him mercifully unconscious through the worst of the pain. Hope checked on him hourly, adjusting his position and ensuring the splint remained secure. Garrett found her on the porch at sunset, staring out at the painted sky above the distant mountains. He offered her a cup of coffee, which she accepted gratefully. "Thank you," he said simply, leaning against the porch railing. "Samuel would likely have lost that leg without your help." "He still might," Hope cautioned. "Infection is the real danger now." Garrett studied her in the fading light. "Where did you really learn to handle injuries like that? And don't say from your mother's doctor. You worked with the confidence of someone with real experience." Hope tensed, considering her answer carefully. "Life hasn't always been kind, Mr. Hawkins. I've had to learn many things out of necessity, including how to disappear when the sheriff asks questions," he asked quietly, her head snapped up, eyes wide with alarm. Garrett held up a placating hand. "Wilson mentioned nothing specific," he assured her. "Just that you seemed nervous around him. I noticed things, Miss O'Connor, like how you never mentioned where you're traveling from or who this family is you're supposedly visiting." "It's not your concern," Hope said stiffly, rising to leave. "Perhaps not," Garrett agreed, not moving to stop her. "But if you're in trouble, real trouble, there might be ways I can help that don't involve you running until you collapse at another well." Hope paused, one hand on the door. "Why would you help a stranger?" "You're not a stranger anymore," he replied simply. "You saved my friend's life today." "I repaid a debt," she corrected. "Now we're even." Garrett's expression softened. "Life isn't about keeping ledgers, Miss O'Connor. Sometimes people help each other simply because they can." Hope wanted desperately to believe him, but experience had taught her that kindness always came with expectations, sometimes spoken, sometimes not. What would Garrett Hawkins expect once he knew the truth about her? "Good night, Mr. Hawkins," she said finally. "I hope Samuel rests comfortably." Inside, Hope paced her room again, more agitated than before. The stage would leave tomorrow afternoon. She should be relieved 24 more hours and she could continue her journey, putting Oatman and its perceptive cowboy behind her. Instead, she felt an unfamiliar reluctance to leave. It wasn't just gratitude she felt toward Garrett Hawkins, she realized with dismay. There was something about his steady presence, his unassuming kindness that drew her to him. In another life, a life where she wasn't running, where her past wasn't a constant shadow, perhaps she could have explored that feeling. But that wasn't her life. Hope O'Connor had secrets that would destroy any chance of a respectable future in a place like this. Better to leave while she could, before Garrett Hawkins discovered exactly what kind of woman he'd rescued at the well. Morning arrived with unexpected commotion. Hope woke to urgent voices and hurried footsteps in the hallway. She dressed quickly in her borrowed blue dress and opened her door to find Mrs. Jenkins rushing past with an armful of bandages. "What's happening?" Hope called after her. "Samuel's fever spiked overnight, Mrs." Jenkins replied over her shoulder. "He's delirious. Garrett sent word to Kingman for another doctor, but it will be hours before anyone arrives." Hope followed without hesitation. In the downstairs room, Samuel thrashed weakly on the bed, his forehead slick with sweat despite the cool morning. Garrett sat beside him, looking as though he hadn't slept at all. He glanced up when Hope entered, relief evident in his exhausted eyes. "The wound's infected," he said grimly. "Started noticing the signs around midnight." Hope approached the bed and carefully examined Samuel's leg. The skin around the injury was hot to the touch, red and swollen. When she unwrapped the bandage, the wound itself showed angry red streaks extending upward, blood poisoning beginning to spread. "We need to clean it again," she said decisively, "and poultice it to draw out the infection." "Do you have any whiskey left?" "Half a bottle," Mrs. Jenkins confirmed. Honey and herbs yarrow if you have it, or comfrey, Mrs. Jenkins nodded. I keep dried herbs for teas and medicines. I'll gather what we need. For the next hour, Hope worked methodically, reopening parts of the wound to allow the infection to drain, cleaning everything thoroughly with whiskey despite Samuel's feverish protests. She prepared a poultice of honey and herbs, applying it directly to the worst areas before rebandaging the leg. Now we wait, she told Garrett, washing blood from her hands in a basin. Keep him cool with wet cloths. The fever's his body fighting the infection, that's good, but if it gets too high, it could cause other problems. Garrett looked at her with newfound respect. Where did you learn all this? Hope hesitated. My mother. After she became ill, we couldn't afford a doctor all the time. I learned from books from other women from necessity. It wasn't entirely a lie, though it omitted crucial details. You would have made a fine doctor, he observed. In another life, perhaps, she replied softly. Women aren't exactly welcomed in medicine. More's the pity, Garrett said. Samuel would be in a bad way without you. Hope stayed by Samuel's bedside through the morning, bathing his forehead with cool water and monitoring his breathing. Garrett remained as well, speaking occasionally but mostly keeping a silent vigil. By noon, the fever seemed to be abating slightly. A good sign, Hope assured Garrett when she noticed the relief on his face. His body's fighting back. Like someone else I know, Garrett commented with a slight smile. Hope glanced at him questioningly. You, he clarified. Fighting against whatever drove you to collapse at that well, there's a strength in you that most men would envy. The unexpected compliment flustered her. I just do what needs doing. As do I, Garrett replied, which is why I need to ask if you still plan to take the stage today. Hope stiffened. That was always my intention. Samuel needs continued care, Garrett said carefully. The doctor from Kingman might not arrive until evening, if at all. I'd consider it a personal favor if you delay your journey until he's stable. Mr. Hawkins, Garrett, he corrected gently. After saving my friend's life, I think we can dispense with formalities. Garrett, she conceded. I can't stay in Oatman. There are complications. Because of the man you're running from in San Francisco, Hope's blood ran cold. How did you talk in your sleep? Garrett said apologetically. Mrs. Jenkins heard you through the door when she brought up hot water yesterday. Nightmares, she said, about someone finding you. Humiliation and fear washed over Hope in equal measure. How much had she revealed in her sleep? How much did they know? It's not what you think, she began defensively. I don't presume to know what it is, Garrett replied, his voice steady and free of judgment. But I do know that you're safer here than on a stage traveling alone through territory where 3 coaches have been robbed in the past month. Hope hadn't known about the robberies. The news only reinforced her precarious situation, danger behind, danger ahead. I'll stay until the doctor arrives, she decided finally. Then I really must go. Garrett nodded, looking relieved. Thank you. I'll let the stage driver know you won't be on today's coach. Later that afternoon, as Samuel continued to improve, Mrs. Jenkins insisted Hope take a break. You've been at his side for hours, the older woman said firmly. Get some fresh air. I'll sit with him. Reluctantly, Hope agreed. She found herself walking down Oatman's Main Street, past the saloon where raucous laughter spilled through the batwing doors, past the assay office where Alina's husband could be seen through the window examining a rock sample. The town felt different, somehow less threatening, more like a community of real people with their own struggles and joys. At the edge of town, Hope paused by the well where Garrett had found her. It seemed like weeks ago rather than just days. She ran her fingers over the rough stone, remembering the desperation she'd felt and the unexpected kindness that had followed. Thinking of drawing water or just remembering, Garrett's voice came from behind her. Hope turned to find him approaching, leading his horse. Both, perhaps. How's Samuel? Sleeping peacefully, fever's down considerably. He tied his horse to a nearby post and joined her by the well. I wanted to thank you again. You've thanked me enough, Hope demurred, Not for Samuel, Garrett clarified, for trusting me enough to stay even temporarily. Hope looked away. I didn't have much choice. There's always a choice, he countered gently. You could have left despite my request. Something made you stay. The directness of his gaze made it difficult to dissemble. Samuel needed help, she said simply. I couldn't leave him suffering. And that's exactly why I trust you, Hope O'Connor, Garrett said, using her first name for the first time. Whatever you're running from, whoever you're afraid of, it hasn't changed your fundamental decency. Hope felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. You don't know me, she whispered. I know enough, he replied. I know you risked your own safety to help a stranger. I know you have medical knowledge that you've used to ease suffering rather than for personal gain. And I know that whatever happened in San Francisco frightened you badly enough to flee across the desert alone. Hope stood frozen, torn between the longing to unburden herself and the terror of rejection that would surely follow. I worked at a place called Rosalind's, she finally said, her voice barely audible. It wasn't respectable. Garrett's expression remained unchanged. I assumed it was something like that. You knew, Hope asked, shocked. I suspected, he corrected. Your medical knowledge, your wariness around men, the way you flinch when touched unexpectedly, it painted a picture. And yet you still helped me, still. She couldn't finish the thought, still treated you like a human being deserving of respect, Garrett suggested quietly. Yes. Because that's what you are. The sheriff, Wilson, has no interest in the past lives of people who aren't causing trouble in his jurisdiction, Garrett assured her. Unless there's more to the story, Hope swallowed hard. There's a man, Edward Blackwell. He owns Rosalind's, though the establishment bears her name for propriety's sake. He doesn't let his investments leave willingly. Understanding dawned in Garrett's eyes. He's looking for you. He was when I left San Francisco, Hope confirmed. I don't know if he still is. I took something when I left, something valuable to him. Her hand went unconsciously to the locket around her neck. What's in the locket? Garrett asked, noticing the gesture. Hope hesitated, then opened the small gold oval to reveal not a portrait but a small folded paper. Records. Names of men who visit Rosalind's, powerful men who wouldn't want their secrets known, Blackwell's insurance against trouble with the law. And your insurance against him, Garrett concluded. Clever. Not clever enough if he finds me, Hope said bitterly. He has connections everywhere, even with law enforcement. That's why I can't stay anywhere too long. Garrett considered this information thoughtfully. Oatman's small and remote, news travels slowly here, and my ranch is even more isolated. Hope looked at him in confusion. What are you suggesting? A proposition, Garrett said carefully. Stay not just until Samuel's stable, but longer. My ranch needs help with cooking and household matters. The pay would be fair, the work honest, and you'd be far from anywhere Blackwell would think to look. You'd employ me. Knowing what I am, I'd employ Hope O'Connor, a skilled healer who needs a safe place, Garrett corrected firmly. What you were before has no bearing on what you could be now. Hope stared at him, searching for the trap, the hidden motive. She found only sincerity in his steady gaze. Why would you take such a risk for me? She asked finally. Garrett looked out over the harsh landscape, considering his answer. After Sarah died, I nearly gave up, on the ranch, on life itself. A stranger showed me kindness when I needed it most, gave me purpose again, by trusting me with responsibilities I didn't feel worthy of. Sometimes a person just needs someone to see them clearly and offer a chance. Hope felt something shift inside her, a wall beginning to crumble, a possibility taking root where before there had been only fear and flight. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've been, she admitted. None of us do until we try, Garrett replied simply. The offer stands, regardless of your answer. Think on it while Samuel recovers. That evening, the doctor from Kingman finally arrived, a gruff older man who examined Samuel thoroughly before pronouncing that Hope's treatment had likely saved both his life and his leg. Whoever cleaned and dressed this wound knew what they were doing, he told Garrett. Another day without proper care and gangrene would have set in for certain. Hope, listening from the doorway, felt a surge of pride at the validation. For years, her value had been measured only by her beauty and ability to please men. To be recognized for a genuine skill, one that helped rather than served the feeling, was indescribable. The doctor left detailed instructions for Samuel's continued care, including exercises to begin once the bone had started to heal. "He'll limp, but he'll walk," was his assessment. "Keep him off the leg entirely for at least 3 weeks." After the doctor departed, Garrett found Hope in the hotel's small kitchen, where she'd been helping Mrs. Jenkins prepare dinner. "The stage to Prescott leaves again on Wednesday," he said without preamble. "Have you considered my offer?" Hope set down the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables. "I have. And it's generous," she acknowledged. "More generous than I deserve." "That's not an answer," Garrett pointed out. Hope met his gaze directly. "If I stay, there would be talk. People would wonder about my sudden appearance, about why you'd employ a strange woman with no references." "People always talk," Garrett replied with a shrug. "I've given them plenty to talk about over the years: the failed prospector who somehow built a successful ranch, the widower who rarely comes to town. One more topic of gossip won't matter much." "It might if Blackwell ever comes looking," Hope countered. "Word travels even to remote places." "Then we'll deal with that if it happens," Garrett said simply. "I'm not a man who scares easily, Hope, Mrs. Jenkins, who had been pretending not to listen while kneading bread dough, finally spoke up. "If I might offer an opinion," she said, dusting flour from her hands, "Garrett's ranch is 15 miles from the nearest neighbor. No one would question a housekeeper there. The place needs a woman's touch, something terrible." Garrett looked mildly offended. "It's not that bad." "It is," Mrs. Jenkins insisted. "And Miss O'Connor here has proven herself capable and trustworthy. I say it's a fine solution for both of you." Hope looked between them, feeling cornered yet strangely hopeful. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This isn't a decision to make hastily." "Of course," Garrett agreed readily. "Take until Wednesday. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." The next morning, Samuel was well enough to have visitors beyond his immediate caregivers. Eleanor Fletcher came by with her husband Thomas, bringing a cake and well wishes. Hope was changing Samuel's bandages when they arrived. "Heard you worked something of a miracle," Thomas said by way of greeting. "Half the town's talking about the mysterious lady doctor staying at the hotel." Hope froze, panic rising in her throat. "I'm not a doctor," she corrected quickly. "Just someone with some basic medical knowledge." "More than basic, from what Garrett says," Eleanor commented, setting the cake on a side table. "Samuel would have lost that leg without you." Samuel, more lucid than he'd been since the accident, nodded in agreement. "Miss O'Connor saved my life," he said gravely. "I won't forget it." The Fletchers stayed only briefly, but their visit left Hope unsettled. If people were already talking about her, how long before someone connected her to the woman who had fled San Francisco? How long before Blackwell heard rumors of a skilled healer in Arizona territory who matched the description of his missing property? She found Garrett checking on Samuel's horse in the small stable behind the hotel. "People are talking about me," she said without preamble. Garrett continued brushing the animal's coat. "People talk about everything in small towns. It'll pass once the next interesting thing happens." "You don't understand," Hope pressed. "Attention is dangerous for me." "I understand better than you think," Garrett replied, setting down the brush and turning to face her. "But hiding forever isn't living, Hope. At some point you have to stop running and start building something new." "Easy for you to say," she retorted. "You haven't experienced, haven't I?" He interrupted gently. "You think you're the only one with a past they'd rather forget. Before I came to Arizona, I was a different man with a different name. The law in Missouri might still have questions for a young troublemaker named Garrett Hayes who rode with Quantrill's raiders during the war." Hope stared at him in shock. "You changed your name," added a letter, "changed states, started fresh," he confirmed. Was barely 20 when I made that choice. The war had ended, but the killing hadn't not for some. I wanted no part of it anymore. But that's different, Hope argued. You chose to leave that life. I was forced into mine. The past is the past, Garrett said firmly. All that matters is what you do now with whatever chance you've been given. His words resonated deeply, challenging the narrative she'd constructed about her life, that she was permanently marked by her experiences, forever unworthy of a respectable existence. What if that wasn't true? What if there really was a possibility of something different? I'm afraid, she admitted quietly, of Blackwell finding you. Of that, she agreed, but also of hoping for something better and having it snatched away. It would be worse somehow than never hoping at all. Garrett's expression softened. Hope suits you, both the name and the feeling. Don't let fear rob you of it. That afternoon, a telegram arrived for the sheriff. Hope was helping Samuel with some broth when Mrs. Jenkins rushed in, her expression worried. Sheriff's looking for you, she said breathlessly. Got a wire from San Francisco. Hope's spoon clattered against the bowl. About me, don't know, Mrs. Jenkins admitted. But he's asking everyone if they've seen a woman matching your description. Dark hair, blue eyes, mid-20s. Garrett, who had been sitting nearby reading, stood immediately. Where is Wilson now? Checking the saloon, Mrs. Jenkins replied. He'll come here next, I'd wager. Hope's mind raced with panic. This was exactly what she'd feared, Blackwell's reach extending even to this remote corner of Arizona. She looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape route. My wagon's out back, Garrett said decisively. We need to move Samuel anyway, now that he's stable enough to travel. We can leave now before Wilson arrives. But if he's looking for me specifically? Hope protested. He's asking about a woman matching your description, Mrs. Jenkins pointed out. Hasn't used your name from what I heard. Might be coincidence. Hope doubted that, but she had no better options. What about my things upstairs? I'll gather them and bring them out back, Mrs. Jenkins promised. Go now before it's too late. With practiced efficiency, Garrett and Mrs. Jenkins prepared Samuel for transport, settling him carefully in the bed of Garrett's wagon with blankets cushioning his injured leg. Hope kept watch at the window, her heart pounding every time someone passed by on the street. When all was ready, Hope slipped out the back door of the hotel and climbed onto the wagon seat beside Garrett. Mrs. Jenkins handed up a small bundle containing Hope's few possessions. God go with you, the older woman said quietly. And don't be strangers, come back when it's safe. Garrett nodded his thanks and flicked the reins. The wagon pulled away from the hotel just as Sheriff Wilson's distinctive figure appeared at the far end of the street, heading their way. Hope ducked her head, using the wide brim of a borrowed hat to shield her face as they passed him. He didn't look twice, Garrett murmured once they were safely past. Just a rancher taking his injured foreman home. Hope didn't relax until Oatman had disappeared behind them and the open country stretched in all directions. Only then did she allow herself to consider what she'd done. Fled again, but this time not alone. This time with allies who knew her secrets and helped her anyway. Thank you, she said softly. Garrett glanced at her, then returned his attention to the trail ahead. For what? For risking yourself. If Blackwell discovers you helped me. Let me worry about Edward Blackwell, Garrett replied, his voice hardening slightly. Men like him only have power when others fear them. They traveled for nearly 3 hours, the wagon moving carefully over rough terrain to avoid jostling Samuel unnecessarily. Hope checked on him frequently, relieved to find his fever remained low and his spirits relatively good despite the discomfort of travel. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Garrett pointed ahead to where the landscape opened into a small valley. Home, he said simply. The ranch was modest, but well-maintained, a main house built of sturdy logs, a large barn, corrals for horses and cattle, and several smaller outbuildings. A creek ran along one edge of the property, with cottonwood trees providing rare shade in the arid landscape. It's beautiful, Hope said honestly. It's a work in progress, Garrett replied, though she could hear the pride in his voice. Started with just 20 acres and a dozen head of cattle. Now it's over 200 acres with a herd of nearly 100. You built all this yourself. With help, he acknowledged, nodding toward Samuel in the back of the wagon. Samuel's been with me since the beginning. Few other hands come and go with the seasons. They stopped first at a small cabin near the main house. Samuel's place, Garrett explained as they carefully transferred the injured man to his own bed. Hope made him comfortable while Garrett brought in supplies and water. I'll check on you regularly, Hope promised Samuel, but call out if you need anything before then. Samuel nodded gratefully. Thank you, Miss O'Connor, for everything. As they walked toward the main house, Hope felt a strange combination of trepidation and anticipation. This place represented something she'd never allowed herself to consider a fresh start, a safe haven, a chance to be something other than what her circumstances had forced her to become. It's not fancy, Garrett warned as he opened the door, but it's solid and warm in winter. The house was indeed simple, a large main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, a rough-hewn table with chairs. 2 doors led off the main room, presumably to bedrooms. Everything was clean but Spartan, clearly the dwelling of a man who viewed his home as primarily functional. This would be your room, Garrett said, opening one of the doors to reveal a small bedroom with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the creek. It was meant to be a nursery, but he trailed off, the old grief momentarily visible in his eyes. For you and Sarah, Hope said softly, understanding. Garrett nodded once, then continued more briskly. The kitchen needs organizing by someone who actually knows how a kitchen should function. And there's mending, cleaning, cooking, more than enough work to justify your presence here if anyone should ask. And when Sheriff Wilson inevitably comes calling, Hope asked, he'll find a rancher and his housekeeper, Garrett replied simply. Nothing more, nothing less. Unless you've given him a specific name to look for, there's no reason he'd connect you to whoever he's seeking. Hope wished she could share his confidence. Blackwell is thorough. He doesn't give up easily on things he considers his property. You are not property, Garrett said firmly. Not his, not anyone's. And the sooner you believe that, the sooner you can start living instead of just surviving. That night, after a simple meal and checking once more on Samuel, Hope stood on the small porch of the main house, watching as stars appeared in the vast desert sky. The air was cooling rapidly, the way it always did once the sun disappeared, but she welcomed the chill after the day's heat. Garrett joined her, offering a cup of coffee. Penny for your thoughts. I was thinking about stars, she replied, accepting the cup. How they're the same stars I looked at in San Francisco, yet they seem different here, brighter, closer somehow. Less city smoke, Garrett suggested, and less fog. Perhaps. Hope sipped the strong coffee, or perhaps it's that I'm seeing them through different eyes, the person I was there. She didn't have much reason to look up at stars. Garrett leaned against the porch railing beside her, close but not touching. Who was she? Before Rosalind's, I mean. The question caught Hope off guard. Few had ever asked about her past, who she had been before circumstance and desperation led her to Madame Rosalind's doorstep. Her name was Hope O'Connor, she said slowly. Her father was a shopkeeper in Denver who died of pneumonia when she was 16. Her mother took in sewing to make ends meet but fell ill herself a year later. There were doctor's bills, rent due, and a landlord who offered an alternative form of payment. Garrett's expression darkened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. She refused him at first, Hope went on, speaking of herself in the third person as though it were someone else's story. But as her mother worsened and the money ran out, she eventually agreed just once, she told herself, just to keep them from being evicted. But once became twice, became regular arrangements. After her mother died, there seemed no point in pretending she was anything other than what she'd become. And San Francisco? Garrett asked quietly. The landlord had a brother who ran gambling houses in California. He arranged for her transfer, like she was a piece of furniture being shipped west. Madame Rosalind's was actually a step-up cleaner, more exclusive, but also harder to leave. The investment in her was higher. Garrett was silent for a long moment after she finished. Hope braced herself for disgust, for withdrawal, for the judgment she'd seen in other men's eyes when they learned the full truth of her past. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for trusting me with your story." "You're not repulsed?" Hope asked hesitantly. "By what?" Garrett challenged gently. "By a young girl doing whatever was necessary to care for her dying mother. By a woman trapped in circumstances beyond her control." He shook his head. "The only thing that repulses me is the men who took advantage of your vulnerability." Hope felt tears threatening again and blinked rapidly to hold them back. "I've done things, we've all done things," Garrett interrupted. "The question is whether those things define who we are now, who we choose to be going forward." His words penetrated the carefully constructed walls around Hope's heart, walls built over years to protect herself from caring, from hoping, from believing in the possibility of a different life. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine a future not dictated by fear. "I want to stay," she said finally, the decision crystallizing in that moment. "Not just because I'm running from something, but because I might be running towards something worth having." Garrett's smile was small but genuine. "That's the best reason I can think of." The days that followed established a routine that felt both strange and comforting to Hope. She rose early to prepare breakfast, tended to Samuel's leg, kept the house in order, and cooked meals for Garrett and the 2 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse. The work was honest and straightforward, exhausting in its own way, but lacking the soul-deep weariness that had characterized her life at Rosalind's. Samuel improved steadily under her care, the infection receding and the bone beginning to knit. He proved to be good company, a man of few words but sharp intelligence, who treated her with unfailing respect. From him, she learned more about Garrett, how he had arrived in Arizona with nothing, how he had worked the most dangerous mining jobs to save enough for his first cattle, how he had nursed Sarah through her final days without once leaving her side. "Never seen a man love a woman so completely," Samuel told her one afternoon as she changed his bandages. "Broke something in him when she passed, been worried he'd never find his way back to living fully." Hope absorbed this information carefully, not allowing herself to read too much into it. Garrett had been kind to her, had offered her safety and employment, but she had no illusions about what that meant. Men like Garrett Hawkins, honest men, respectable men, didn't court women with pasts like hers, no matter how understanding they seemed. A week after their arrival at the ranch, Sheriff Wilson rode up to the main house just as Hope was hanging laundry on the line. She saw him coming and froze, panic rising in her throat. Garrett emerged from the barn, intercepting the sheriff before he reached the house. Hope couldn't hear their conversation, but she watched as Garrett gestured toward the main house, then led Wilson toward Samuel's cabin instead. A clear attempt to keep the sheriff away from her. Hope retreated inside, heart pounding. She paced the main room anxiously, wondering if she should flee, if Wilson had somehow connected her to the woman Blackwell was seeking. But where would she go? How far could she get on foot in the unforgiving desert? 20 minutes later, Garrett returned alone. Hope nearly collapsed with relief. "What did he want?" she asked immediately. "Asking about a woman who disappeared from a San Francisco establishment," Garrett replied, removing his hat. "Apparently her employer is offering a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery." Hope's hand went instinctively to the locket. "Did he describe her? Dark hair, blue eyes, mid-20s, traveling alone?" Garrett met her gaze steadily. "I told him the only woman here is my housekeeper, Mrs. Harper, a widow from Tucson who's been with me for months. He had no reason to question it." "Mrs. Harper," Hope repeated, confused. "Seemed prudent to give you a different name, just in case," Garrett explained. "I hope you don't mind the widow part. Creates fewer questions about a woman living on a ranch with a single man." The thoughtfulness of his precautions touched her. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," Garrett admitted, "but enough to buy us time. Wilson's heading back to Oatman today, said he needs to send a telegram to San Francisco reporting no success in his search." Hope nodded, relief mingling with an ongoing wariness. "He'll keep looking elsewhere." "Probably," Garrett agreed. "But Arizona territory is vast, with countless places to disappear, and Blackwell can't personally search every ranch and homestead." That evening, after chores were done and supper cleared away, Garrett surprised Hope by asking if she'd join him on the porch. The night was cool but not cold, the stars as brilliant as ever above them. "I've been thinking," he said after they'd sat in companionable silence for a while, "about your locket, the papers inside." Hope tensed slightly. "What about them?" "They're your protection, but also your tether to the past," Garrett observed. "As long as Blackwell believes you have them, he'll never stop looking." "I know," Hope acknowledged, "but without them I'd have no leverage if he found me." "What if there was another way?" Garrett suggested. "What if those papers were in the hands of someone with the authority to use them not against the men named in them, but against Blackwell himself?" Hope frowned, not following. "What do you mean?" "I have a friend in Prescott, a lawyer, who once helped me with land claims," Garrett explained. "Honest man, well connected. If he had those papers held in trust with instructions to release the information if anything happened to you, Blackwell would have no reason to pursue me," Hope finished, understanding dawning. "The damage would already be done if he harmed me." "Exactly," Garrett nodded. "And if word reached him that the papers were no longer in your possession, but secured with legal consequences should you be harmed?" Hope considered the idea carefully. The locket had been both her security and her burden for months, the only thing standing between her and a return to Rosalind's. But Garrett's plan made sense. It would transform her single piece of leverage from a secret she had to guard into a protected insurance policy. "Your lawyer friend can be trusted?" she asked. "With his life," Garrett confirmed. "He helped me establish my new identity when I came here, knows how to keep secrets." Hope's hand went to the locket around her neck, the physical reminder of her bondage to the past. Slowly, she unfastened it and held it in her palm, feeling its familiar weight perhaps for the last time. "When could we see him?" she asked, her decision made. "I need to go to Prescott next week for supplies," Garrett replied. "You could come with me." Hope nodded, handing him the locket. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and she felt a now familiar warmth spread through her at the contact. It was becoming harder to ignore the growing connection between them, not just gratitude on her part or compassion on his, but something deeper, something that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. Garrett seemed to feel it too, his gaze lingering on her face in the lantern light. "Hope," he began, his voice lower than usual. "I want you to know that your position here isn't conditional on anything. You're free to stay as long as you wish as my housekeeper or in any other capacity that suits you." The careful phrasing revealed his awareness of the power imbalance between them, employer and employee, rescuer and rescued. It was one more example of the fundamental decency that separated him from the other men who had shaped her life. "Thank you," she replied softly, "for understanding without me having to explain." The journey to Prescott the following week marked Hope's first significant outing since arriving at the ranch. Samuel was well enough to be left in the care of the ranch hands, and the opportunity to secure her future was too important to delay. They traveled in Garrett's wagon, the 2-day journey giving them ample time for conversation. Hope found herself sharing memories she'd long suppressed, happy moments from her childhood in Denver, dreams she'd once harbored of becoming a teacher, books she'd loved before life had forced her to set aside such luxuries. Garrett listened attentively, offering stories of his own in return: his youth in Missouri, his misguided time with Quantrill's raiders, his eventual disillusionment with violence that had driven him westward seeking redemption. "I was angry after the war," he admitted as they made camp the first night. My father's farm was burned by Union soldiers. He never recovered from the loss, died of what the doctor called heart failure, but what I knew was a broken spirit. I wanted revenge, thought I'd find it riding with Quantrill. What changed? Hope asked, watching him tend the small campfire. We raided a homestead that was supposedly harboring Union sympathizers, Garrett replied, his expression haunted by the memory. Found only a woman and her children. Our leader said to burn it anyway, make an example. That night I realized I'd become what I hated most, someone who destroyed innocent lives for a cause that had lost its meaning. Hope understood the weight of such a realization. So you left, rode out that night, Garrett confirmed. Headed west and never looked back. Changed my name, swore I'd build something instead of destroying from then on. And you have, Hope observed, gesturing to indicate the supplies in their wagon, evidence of the prosperous ranch he'd created. Garrett smiled slightly. Land doesn't care about your past, just how you treat it in the present. The cattle don't know I once rode with raiders. The crops don't grow differently because I changed my name. People are less forgiving, Hope said softly. Some are, Garrett agreed. But the right ones understand that who we were isn't always who we are or who we can become. His words stayed with her as they continued their journey the next day, winding through increasingly mountainous terrain, until Prescott appeared in the valley below a proper town with brick buildings and boardwalks, far larger than Oatman. Garrett's lawyer friend, Mr. Douglas, maintained an office near the territorial government buildings. He welcomed Garrett warmly and treated Hope with courteous respect as Garrett explained the situation in carefully worded terms. So these papers, Mr. Douglas clarified, examining the contents of the locket, contain information that could harm certain influential men in San Francisco, as well as this Mr. Blackwell who seeks their return. Precisely, Garrett confirmed. We need them held in trust, with clear instructions that they be sent to the proper authorities if anything should happen to Miss O'Connor. Mr. Douglas nodded thoughtfully. And you wish Mr. Blackwell to be informed of this arrangement? Yes, Hope spoke up. He needs to understand that harming me or forcing my return would trigger exactly the outcome he fears most. A clever solution, the lawyer approved. I can draft the necessary documents today, and I have colleagues in San Francisco who could deliver the message to Mr. Blackwell discreetly. Relief washed over Hope as she signed the papers Mr. Douglas prepared. For the first time since fleeing San Francisco, she felt the weight of constant fear beginning to lift. The documents would be sealed and secured in the lawyer's safe, with copies sent to banks in both Prescott and Santa Fe for additional security. It may take several weeks for confirmation that Mr. Blackwell received our message, Mr. Douglas cautioned as they prepared to leave. Until then, continued discretion would be advisable. We understand, Garrett assured him. Thank you for your help. They spent the night at Prescott's finest hotel, Garrett insisting on separate rooms despite the expense before beginning the return journey the following morning. Hope felt different somehow, lighter despite the physical fatigue of travel. The locket no longer hung around her neck, but neither did the burden it represented. As they approached the ranch on the second day of their return journey, Hope gazed out at the landscape that had become surprisingly familiar in the short time she'd been there. The mountains on the horizon, the scattered cattle grazing on sparse vegetation, the cottonwoods marking the creek that ran through Garrett's property, all of it felt increasingly like home. Penny for your thoughts, Garrett asked, echoing his question from weeks before. Hope smiled. I was thinking that I never expected to feel safe again, she admitted. Yet somehow I do. I'm glad, he replied simply. Everyone deserves that much at least. And you, she asked, what were you thinking? Garrett's gaze remained fixed on the trail ahead, though a slight flush colored his tanned face. I was thinking that my house hasn't felt like a home since Sarah died, until recently. The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to give it voice. But it was there, growing stronger with each passing day, the recognition that what had begun as charity and necessity was becoming something else entirely. Life at the ranch fell back into its routine after their return, though subtle changes marked the shifting dynamics between them. Garrett began lingering over meals, engaging Hope in conversations about books they'd read or sharing stories of his cattle drives. Sometimes in the evenings, he would read aloud from one of the few volumes he owned while Hope mended clothes or kneaded bread for the next day. Samuel noticed, of course. Now able to move with the aid of crutches Garrett had fashioned, he often joined them for evening meals, his knowing glances moving between them whenever their hands brushed or their gazes held too long. "Boss never was good at hiding his feelings," he commented to Hope one afternoon as she helped him exercise his healing leg. "Wears his heart plain on his face?" Hope focused on gently bending Samuel's knee. "I don't know what you mean." Samuel's laugh was knowing but kind. "Course you don't. Just like you don't notice how you light up when he comes in from the range." Heat flooded Hope's cheeks, but she didn't deny it. The truth was, she had begun to care deeply for Garrett Hawkins, his steadiness, his integrity, the quiet strength that demanded nothing yet offered everything. But the gap between caring and allowing herself to act on those feelings remained vast. "It's not that simple," she said finally. "Never is," Samuel agreed, "but sometimes it's not as complicated as we make it either." A month after their trip to Prescott, a letter arrived from Mr. Douglas. Hope's hands trembled as she opened it, Garrett standing silently beside her. The message was brief but clear. Blackwell had been informed of the arrangements regarding the documents. His initial reaction had been rage, but sources indicated he had ultimately accepted the situation as a loss and redirected his attention to other matters. "He's given up," Hope whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "I'm free." The realization crashed over her like a wave, not just relief, but a dizzying expanse of possibility. For years, her choices had been constrained by circumstance, then by fear. Now, with Blackwell no longer hunting her, genuine options lay before her for perhaps the first time in her adult life. She could go anywhere, be anyone. The stage lines ran east to new territories, new towns where no one knew her past. She could find legitimate employment, perhaps even save enough to pursue the education she'd once dreamed of. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. Yet as she looked at Garrett, his expression careful, giving nothing away of his own hopes or fears, she realized that the most appealing possibility of all stood right before her. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. Hope folded the letter carefully, buying time as she gathered her courage. "That depends," she replied, her heart pounding. "On what?" "On whether my employer still needs a housekeeper," she said, then added more softly, "and on whether the man I've come to care for might want something more than an employee." Garrett's controlled expression broke, hope flaring in his eyes. "Hope," he breathed, stepping closer. "Are you saying you want to stay? Not because you have to, but because you choose to?" "If I'm welcome," she confirmed, her voice steadier now. "Not just as your housekeeper, Garrett." He reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. "You must know how I feel," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I never wanted you to feel obligated or trapped. Your freedom to choose matters more than my wishes." "And if I choose you?" Hope asked, allowing herself to voice the desire she'd been holding back for weeks. "If I choose this life, this place, us," Garrett's smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert, "then I'd be the happiest man in Arizona territory," he said simply. "Because I love you, Hope O'Connor, have almost since I found you at that well." The words washed over her like healing rain. Love not as transaction or obligation, but as choice and gift. Hope stepped closer, closing the remaining distance between them. "I love you too," she whispered, "and I choose to stay." Garrett's kiss was gentle at first, as though he still feared she might break or flee. But when Hope responded with the depth of feeling she'd been suppressing for so long, his restraint crumbled. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as though he never intended to let go. They were married 3 weeks later, with Samuel standing as witness alongside Mrs. Jenkins, who had traveled from Oatman for the occasion. The ceremony was simple, performed by a circuit-riding preacher who visited the area monthly. Hope wore a new dress of pale blue, purchased during a special trip to Prescott. Garrett wore his finest shirt, freshly pressed, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. "Do you, Garrett Hawkins, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do," Garrett replied, his voice clear and certain. "And do you, Hope O'Connor, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Hope looked into Garrett's eyes, seeing all the promise of the future reflected there. "I do," she said, the words both vow and liberation. "Then, by the authority vested in me," the preacher continued, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." As Garrett kissed her, sealing their union before friends who had become family, Hope marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From desperate and dying at a desert well to beloved and belonging in a home she had helped create. That evening, after their guests had departed and they were finally alone, Garrett led Hope onto the porch of what was now truly their home. The stars spread across the desert sky like diamonds scattered on velvet, more brilliant than she had ever seen them. "Happy?" Garrett asked, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever imagined possible," Hope replied honestly. "You gave me back my future when you found me at that well." Garrett shook his head. "You always had the strength within you," he corrected gently. "All I did was offer water and a place to rest until you found it again." Hope leaned against him, content in a way she had never known before. "Then drink and stay a while," she quoted softly, remembering his words from their first meeting. "Not just a while," Garrett murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "A lifetime." 5 years later, Hope stood on that same porch, watching as Garrett demonstrated roping techniques to their 4-year-old son, James. Their 2-year-old daughter, Sarah, named for the woman whose memory would always be honored in their home, sat on Hope's hip, clapping delightedly at her father's skill. The ranch had prospered, expanding to nearly 500 acres. Samuel, now walking with only a slight limp, had his own small herd grazing on adjacent land that Garrett had helped him purchase. Mrs. Jenkins visited regularly, always bringing gifts for the children and news from Oatman. Sheriff Wilson had long since stopped looking for the mysterious woman from San Francisco. Edward Blackwell, according to occasional correspondence from Mr. Douglas, had encountered legal troubles of his own and no longer posed any threat. Hope's past remained a part of her not forgotten, but transformed from burden to testament of survival. She had established a reputation in the area as a skilled healer, offering her knowledge to neighboring ranches and homesteads when illness or injury struck. Some whispered about her uncanny ability with herbs and poultices, but most simply appreciated her calm competence in times of crisis. "Mama, look," James called excitedly as he successfully twirled his small practice rope. "I did it." "Well done, sweetheart." Hope called back, genuine pride in her voice. Her children would grow up knowing nothing but love and security, the childhood she had lost, preserved and recreated for the next generation. Garrett released the practice calf and came to join them on the porch, ruffling James's hair as he passed. "Think we have a natural cowboy on our hands," he told Hope with a wink. "Like his father," Hope agreed, leaning into his embrace as he wrapped an arm around her and their daughter. As the sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Hope reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment from desperate and shaking at a well to surrounded by love in a home she had helped build. The thirst that had nearly claimed her life had led her, against all odds, to the very place she was meant to be. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Hope smiled up at him, her heart full. About how sometimes the things that seem like endings are really beginnings in disguise. Garrett's answering smile held all the understanding and love that had become the foundation of their shared life, and how a simple offer of water can change everything. For both of us, Hope agreed softly, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as their children giggled and the Arizona sun sank below the horizon, closing another day in the life they had built together, a life that had begun with hunger and fear at a desert well, but had blossomed into something more beautiful than either could have imagined.